The pillow is the optic chiasm, and then the deepest recess, where the pituitary gland safely sits in the middle of the skull, is the hypophyseal fossa. So that's referred to as the bed of the sphenoid. Let's talk about the holes associated with the sphenoid. Okay? So I like to learn them SOLR. So looking at it first from the inside, we start from the lateral. We see this little tiny hole, foramen spinosum. Then we have an oval-shaped hole you can really see on this side. That's foramen ovale. So spinosum, ovale, and then come to the center of the skull on either side, right on either side of the sella turcica, and this is lacerum, lacerum, foramen lacerum. So SOL is spinosum ovale lacerum. Okay, spinosum ovale lacerum. Now notice we talked about the holes of the temporal bone, which are just posterior to that, and here is the carotid canal. The carotid canal goes from medial to lateral. Foramen lacerum is medial to the carotid canal. Okay, so SOL. R, these are like the headlights on the car. All these holes have been oriented superior to inferior. Foramen rotundum goes this way. It's a really, really round, two round holes on either side of the dorsum sellae, oriented in this direction, sort of like headlights on a car, very round holes. So SOL, spinosum ovale lacerum rotundum. And then right above, right below the anterior clinoid processes, between the lesser wing and the greater wing, we see this sort of fissure, this long opening, okay? And if I put this pipe cleaner in through this fissure, it's going to come out at the top of the orbit of the eye. And that is referred to as the superior orbital fissure. So if you look at this, this is looking in towards this is part of the orbit. You can see the lesser wings and the greater wings. That fissure in between these two wings, the lesser and the greater wing, that is the superior orbital fissure, totally formed by the sphenoid bone. Okay, superior orbital fissure. And then we have the hole that comes in and crosses at the optic chiasm. This is the optic foramen or optic canal. Okay, so these are the internal holes associated. Let's review one more time. SOLR, spinosum ovale lacerum rotundum. Right above that is the superior orbital fissure and the optic canal, or optic foramen. From this side, we can see spinosum ovale lacerum. We can't really see the superior orbital fissure or foramen rotundum, so just spinosum ovale lacerum. Okay, so that's the sphenoid. The next bone is the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone, you can see from many different areas, probably best seen from the superior aspect. It's right here in the center of the frontal bone. So here, there's this little space. Here's the frontal bone. There's a little space in the middle. Here's what the ethmoid bone looks like by itself, and it just sits right like that. Okay, so it too forms part of the orbit, sort of the medial wall of the orbit of the eye. This part here that looks like a walnut, you can see part of it when you look into the anterior aperture, nasal aperture, which I'll show you on a skull that has one. Okay, that one doesn't have one. We might have to go to a plastic skull. This one doesn't have too much of a one inside. This one we know doesn't because he was a smoker. This one's pretty good. Okay, so you can see the nose is divided into right and left halves. The top nasal divider, or nasal septum, is formed by this ethmoid bone. You can see this perpendicular plate. sort of dividing it into right and left halves. That's the perpendicular plate, which forms the superior part of the nasal septum. On either side of that, you can't see too well inside these skulls, but on either side of that are another pair of paranasal sinuses. They're held within these lateral masses. From the posterior aspect, you can see that there is a superior nasal concha and an inferior nasal concha. And nasal concha sort of serve to warm or cool the air as you're breathing air in and out. So that's from this aspect. Here is the orbital portion that's in the medial portion of the eye. The top part here, which you see inside the anterior cranial fossa, right here within the frontal bone, this has lots and lots and lots of holes. It sits in a plate, which is called the cribriform plate, and all these holes in the cribriform plate are called olfactory foramina, and therefore the olfactory nerve. So ethmoid is a word that refers to a word meaning sieve. So the air is sifted through these olfactory foramina that sit in the cribriform plate, warming the air if it needs to be warmed, or cooling the air so it stays at a temperature that the body needs at all times. So that is the ethmoid bone. The next bone is the zygomatic bone. Okay. And Peggy always thought that this zygomatic bone looked like the state of Texas. This is your cheekbone, and it's located right here in the skull. It forms part of the orbit, it forms part of the facial bone structure, and it connects here on the lateral side with the temporal bone. This one's easy because all of it is named basically for what it articulates with. So this is the zygomatic bone. It articulates anteriorly with the maxillary bone. So this portion of the zygomatic bone is referred to as the maxillary process. This part of the zygomatic bone articulates with the frontal bone. So this is the frontal process. And this part articulates with the temporal bone. So this is the temporal process. 3 processes on the zygomatic bone. And then it has an orbital portion. So it's this little lip that forms sort of the inferior lateral aspect of the orbit. Again, it's a paired bone. There's one on each side. No holes associated with the zygomatic bone. Okay, next bone is the maxilla. Okay, so the maxilla is a paired bone. It's a facial bone, one on each side of the nose. Part of it forms the lateral side of the nasal cavity. It forms the floor of the orbit, and if we turn it over, it forms the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate. The maxilla also houses most of the teeth, and in these little alveolar pockets. Okay, so 2 bones hold the teeth, the maxilla and the mandible. All right, let me show you what it looks like. Here's one maxilla, and here's the other maxilla. Put them together and they form part of the nasal cavity, the floor of the orbit, and the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate. And this one did a little bit better job holding onto the teeth. Okay, so let's talk about this bone. This bone, like the zygomatic bone, is named for what it articulates with. So this articulates here, this part, articulates with the frontal bone. This part right here goes up, goes on one side of the nasal bones, and here's the orbit. So it's between the orbit and the nasal bones. It connects with the frontal bone, so this part of it, this part right here, is referred to as the frontal process. This part here is going lateral, moving lateral to articulate with this bone, so this part is called the zygomatic process. This part that articulates with the teeth, anything holding the teeth, is referred to as the alveolar process. Alveoli means little pocket or hollow space. So as you can see, these little pockets or hollow spaces where the teeth were, those are the alveolar processes. So that's from the anterior side, also the orbital portion. If we look from the interior part, this maxilla is going to articulate with this posterior bone of the hard palate, which is called the palatine bone. So again, because this is named for what it articulates with, this part of the maxilla is called the palatine process. Okay, so let's review that. This part touching the frontal bone is the frontal process. This part touching the zygomatic bone is the zygomatic process. Anything, a little pocket, hollowed out area housing the teeth, or once housing the teeth, are called alveolar processes. And this part that articulates with the palatine bone, this is called the palatine process. The holes associated with this bone, right here, again, the orbit is your frame of reference. So these are the infraorbital foramina, below the orbit, infraorbital foramina. And the other hole, one hole, when these two maxillary bones come together and we look at the inferior aspect, there is a hole right behind the front teeth. See if I can do this. Okay? Not so much. There's a hole right here. This is the incisive foramen, right in back of the front teeth. Incisive foramen right there. Okay? So that is the maxillary bone. The next bone is the palatine bone. So the palatine bone is a paired bone. It's an L-shaped bone. Okay.
Hang on.
Oh,
Try
sure.
to find it. Okay.
Oh, okay. L-shaped bone. Right here. Okay, it comes together like this. Okay, and it sits in the body. Where the heck is it in the body? Okay, so if you turn the skull upside down, this anterior part was the maxilla, the posterior part is the part of the palatine bone. So if I take this maxilla, here's part of the hard palate, and I'm going to join it. Hold on. I always have to do this. Hold on. That's where I need my Lego. Here we go. Okay. So here is the maxilla without the palatine bone. Palatine process joins up with the palatine bone, and there you have half of the hard palate. You add another palatine bone here and another maxillary bone, and you have the whole hard palate. This is the horizontal plate of, or horizontal process. There's a horizontal process and a vertical or perpendicular process in the palatine bones. It's the horizontal plate and the palatine process of the maxilla that form the whole hard palate. So we have the horizontal plate or horizontal process. This is the vertical or perpendicular process. This bone also forms part of the orbit of the eye. Okay, I'll show you that in a minute. There are three holes associated with this bone. At the top of the vertical or perpendicular process or plate is the sphenopalatine foramen. Okay, you can see it better on this here. Sphenopalatine foramen at the top of the vertical or perpendicular process. And this is the horizontal plate. When we join the horizontal plate with the palatine process, then you can see the holes formed. We have the lesser palatine foramen and the greater palatine foramen. Okay? So greater palatine foramen and lesser palatine foramen. Sometimes there's more than one of the lesser palatine foramen, but they're formed when the maxillary bone joins with the palatine bone. Okay, so just to review, anterior part of the hard palate, named is the maxillary bone, but named for what it articulates with. This is the palatine process. This is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. The holes, greater palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramen, and the hole that you can't see unless it's disarticulated at the top of the vertical plate or process is the sphenopalatine foramen. Okay? And if you look into the orbit of the eye, the palatine orbital portion of the palatine bone is sort of where this fissure and this fissure join, just medial to it. Okay, the next bone is the hyoid bone. Okay, where did I put that little guy? Oh, here he is. Okay, so the hyoid bone is unique. It's the only bone in the skull that doesn't articulate with any other bone. It sits right in the neck, above the thyroid cartilage, okay? And what it's associated with is the muscles of, that help with speech. It attaches to the muscles of the tongue. This is the body here. These are the greater horns, or cornu. Cornu means horn. And these here are the lesser cornu. So the parts, body, greater cornu, or greater horns, and lesser cornus, or lesser horns. Okay, again, it's the only bone in the body that doesn't articulate with any other bone. Okay, next bone is the mandible. The mandible, or the jaw, okay? And the jaw is the only movable bone in the skull, okay? So there is a body. This part is the body. These parts here are the ramus, okay, the branch, the ramus branches off to the skull. And where the ramus and the body join is the angle, mandibular angle. Right here, the chin is called the mental protuberance. Again, anything that houses the teeth, these little pockets, these are the alveolar processes. So whether it's in the maxilla or the mandible, same name, alveolar processes. At the superior aspect of the ramus, this larger, knobbier area is the mandibular condyle, and this is the coronoid process. So mandibular condyle, coronoid process, which we also saw in the humerus when we were studying the appendicular skeleton. In between this notched out area is the mandibular notch. Okay, so condyle, mandibular notch, coronoid process. Those are the external features of this mandible. Internal features, opposite the mental protuberance, are these little tiny tubercles. These are called genial tubercles. Another name for them is mental spines. Then below the molars, you can feel on yourself a bony ridge right below the molars on either side. And this is the mylohyoid line right here. Coming up on the inside of the ramus, there is a foramen. We're talking about the holes now. Okay, and that foramen is referred to as the mandibular foramen, right here, on either side where the ramus is. There's a little flap, I don't know if you can see that, a little flap to the side of that mandibular foramen, and it kind of looks like a tongue, and that's referred to as the lingula. The lingula, a little flap to the side of the mandibular foramen. Okay. On the outside, on either side of the mental part or mental protuberance, these are referred to as the mental foramen. Okay? So 2 sets of holes, mental foramen on either side of the mental protuberance, and mandibular foramen covered by a flap, the lingula. Okay? These are the mylohyoid lines below the molars, genial tubercles or mental spines, anything holding teeth, alveolar process, coronoid process, mandibular notch, mandibular condyle. The ramus, the angle, the body. Okay. The next bone are the lacrimal bones, and these are the tiniest, most fragile bones in the whole skull. See if I can find a skull that has one. Here's a little bit of a one. You can see just how light they are. They're like paper, right here, right on the most innermost part of the skull, the lacrimal bones. And again, they form part of the skull. The other thing that's interesting about the lacrimal bones is if I put this pipe cleaner into the lacrimal duct, it's also called lacrimal fossa, lacrimal canal, it's right on the inferior aspect of the bone, that pipe cleaner's going to come out right inside the nose. And that's the reason when you cry, your nose runs. So that's the lacrimal bone, paired set of bone located inside the orbit of the eye, the lightest, smallest bone in the skull, and it's associated with the fossa. Nasal bones, okay, nasal bones sit right here, right at the top of this open nasal aperture, okay, right here. On either side, they're flanked by the frontal process of the maxillary bones. It's where your glasses are held if you wear glasses. And the reason we don't see the rest of the nose here is because this is the only part of the nose that's actual bone. The rest of the nose is hyaline cartilage. Okay? Next is the inferior nasal concha. Inferior nasal concha, as a paired bone, there's two of them. They are their own bone. Remember, the other nasal concha were attached to this ethmoid bone, the middle nasal concha and the superior nasal concha. These help drain the sinuses. And these are, you can